Good. All right, next we're going to hear from 3 Atlantic staff writers about press freedom, the Pentagon, and national security. Missy Ryan previously worked for Reuters and the Washington Post, covering the Departments of Defense and State, and reported from dozens of countries all over the world. Tom Nichols is Professor Emeritus of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, where he taught for 25 years. And Nancy Youssef has written about U.S. national security for more than 2 decades, previously at the Wall Street Journal and McClatchy newspapers, and has likewise reported all over the world. Please join me in welcoming Missy, Tom, and Nancy. Thank you. Good. Thank you, pal. Good. Thank you. All right. You guys, thanks so much for coming. Good to have you here. So remind everybody why we're even talking about this subject. At other times in other administrations, we've taken for granted, whatever else was going on in policy and politics, that the ability of journalists to gather facts and tell us all the things we needed to know was unobstructed. This idea that you're going to search for the truth and tell everybody what you found. You were able to do that previously. But Nancy, something has changed, right? So what exactly, in your estimation, has changed?
So I'll start with the sort of before.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for having me. And I'll just narrow it to the Pentagon just to give you a sense of perspective. So before October 15th, those of us who covered the Pentagon signed a 1-page agreement. And that 1-page agreement said that if you don't take photographs in the hallway, follow basic rules, you can have a badge and walk around most parts of the building. That didn't mean you could walk into secure rooms or anything, because those are locked, but you could interact with the leadership in the Pentagon and talk to them and hear briefings from them about the key decisions they were making. And by the fall, the Pentagon put out a statement that said we now need to sign a 21-page agreement. And that agreement had 2 essential points in it. One, that we weren't going to publish things that the Pentagon didn't approve, that we wouldn't solicit information, and that we understood that the publication of information, even unclassified information, posed a potential risk. And so we, as a press corps, walked out on October 15th and have been continuing to report outside the building. What I think was lost for the Pentagon is the ability to ride in a Humvee or ride on a ship and interact with the troops. They were not allowing us to do that as an act of kindness. When you're asking for nearly $1 trillion of taxpayer money, when you're asking people to sign up and potentially die for this country, there was an expectation that we would see what that money and that request was going towards, and that they understood that to keep that going, that people needed to see that. And for the press, it's become much, much harder for us to understand what's happening. There's been extraordinary work that has been done since the 15th, and I'm so proud of our press corps and what they've done. But we've, since Christmas, which wasn't that long ago, the United States has conducted strikes in Nigeria, Syria, Somalia, Venezuela, and is now contemplating them in Iran. We've never had a briefing inside the Pentagon to ask commanders about that decision, the operations, how it was conducted, what risks they took, what assets were used. So what's been lost is your ability to know what U.S. troops are doing in your name with your tax dollars at a time when they were being deployed more widely than they had been previously.
Yeah. So you've not been back in the building?
I have not.
Miss, you've not been back in the building?
No, they've had a select number of events with this new Pentagon press corps that's a group of people who did sign the agreement, and they're granted access. There have been a few events that we've asked to attend, and that has not worked out for us so far.
Yeah, and what Missy described sounds like to me essentially pre-publication review by the Pentagon. If you're going to write something, if you sign this document, you're agreeing that they can approve or disapprove of something that you're agreeing
to that in principle. I don't know whether that's actually happening, but you are agreeing to the idea that, even soliciting information that they find problematic, could be a risk to national security or could be objectionable in some way, and that's actually reporting, and we don't feel like, that is any sort of problem. In fact, it's our job, and, there is always tension in the relationship between the media and the government in Washington, and particularly when it comes to national security, because there is classified information, there are undercover agents out in the field and all of those kinds of things. And there have been real moments of friction over the years, but this has been a situation that we've navigated on both sides in a way that I think has served the American public and has led to, frankly, important reforms over the years. Think about the information that was revealed in terms of, for example, the bad conditions at the Walter Reed Medical Center that led to reforms in that area. There's any number of stories that you can point to that actually policymakers in the end were probably happy were out there. Maybe they didn't like it at the time, it was uncomfortable.
Well, you may have in fact told people making policy, making laws, things they did not know until you told them. Of course, that happens all the time,
Right. I mean, secretaries of defense, including Bob Gates, who was under Obama, and George W. Bush, really, didn't love the media and the spotlight at all times, but he was grateful at moments that things that didn't, bubble up through the chain and to his vantage point. And so I say that there is always tension there, and that I think is healthy for society. But when that our ability to actually really shine that spotlight is constrained, I just think it's bad for everyone. It's bad for democracy. Think about there's 1.3 million service members now serving under the Secretary of Defense. The Defense Department includes 3 million people, civilians and uniformed personnel. I mean, that's as Nancy said, a budget that could soon rise to $1.5 trillion. That's a good chunk of change. And so I think we as Americans have really, it's played an important role in our society.
And so to cut the accountability of that off,
we're
which is
still
effectively
trying,
what's
but
happening.
It's the question of and the U.S. military has always welcomed that, and frankly, that's been an important model for other countries around the world. For the countries that fought with the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan, to see that the U.S. military actually, as a policy, because it's part of our democracy, allowed embeds of troops, even when those things led to uncomfortable stories. I think that really is something that, is a soft power thing that is not, right now being utilized.
Could I add something very quickly, which is there was no violation that was committed by any member of the press that led to this change.
It's not in reaction to something.
That's right. And in fact, the most egregious violation happened by the person who put the rules in this magazine. And so I just want to point out, this was not in response to somebody in our press corps violating the rules. Missy so beautifully described it, and the natural tension that was there.
Yeah.
But I think what you saw was a press corps and a Pentagon that were able to navigate that. This was not a reaction, and I just think that's a very important.
Yeah, it's hugely important. Tom, you have a little bit of a different perspective going back on this, because Missy and Nancy have been doing this as journalists forever.
Right.
You used to be one of them, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I don't have nearly the experience Missy and Nancy do.
You've been on the other side of the desk, essentially, right?
I got my first security clearance 40 years ago, which is so long ago that there was stuff I wasn't supposed to tell the Soviets. So... And what strikes me now, I aside from teaching at the Naval War College, I worked on the Hill, and I consulted for the Pentagon and the CIA, and I was a Russia specialist.
Personal staff for a United States senator,
right,
been in the middle of all this.
And I initially began my career studying the Soviet Union, which has given me skills I didn't think I would need again, but here we are.
Turns out, right.
But what strikes me now is, that the way that the national security community is always kind of tight-lipped, and they should be. I mean, there's stuff you're supposed to ask, and we're supposed to say, oh, no, you don't. Yeah. That's part of protecting secrets in a democracy where we find that balance. What strikes me now is that the government views its own people and its own press as more of a threat and more of an enemy than foreign governments. That's the thing that I just find astounding.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand. For years I would contact OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's where you go, when we all know that acronym. And I don't take it personally that now that I'm on the other side of this fence, when I contact them, they say very politely, we have nothing for you on that. And I go, right, I know that's how it goes. But there is also, in just all of these new regulations, the way everything is gated off as a matter of national security. I mean, it really, it's something that when I was on the other side of it, I don't think anybody felt that way about the press or other Americans.
You said the other day, you can't slap, to us, we were talking about this in advance of this panel, you can't slap national security on everything.
Well, and the Trump administration started doing that in the first term, how many cubic billion barrels of peanut butter do we make? Well, soldiers eat peanut butter. That's a national security issue.
Right.
And that has become, I think they learned that early on, that if you just invoke, I mean, look at the situation with tariffs, right? It's an emergency, it's a matter of national security, it's a matter of national interest. So, this has become, I think, abused even beyond what we saw and what I saw in my younger days in the Cold War. And it's really worrisome.
And the consequences of this, which we'll talk about at various times over the next 30 minutes, Nancy did a good, I think, in brief, summary of what those are for all of us, which is there are these things going on all over the world that we find out about, that we read about as Americans, but we actually don't have very much insight into how, why, and all that. And that's what, among other things, is lost.
Yeah, and part of what's happening, I think, is the administration pushes back. Instead of answering a question about something of national importance that citizens need to know about, they pivot to saying, well, these are sensitive operational details. Well, nobody's asking that. Nobody's asking what time the planes take off, although apparently sometimes we find out.
They tell us accidentally.
If you're on the right chat.
But I think that's kind of a dodge. I mean, anyone who's dealt with classified information knows the difference between something you can talk about as a matter of national interest and something that has innate danger attached to it for U.S. troops or the security of the country.
And two things to add, as many people in this room will know, the media, in many cases, I say, talked about the tension going back years. The national media, in numerous instances over the years, has refrained from publishing information that it had because the administration, whichever it was, Republican, Democrat, would make the case that, no, if you publish this, it will, damage, endanger an undercover agent, or, and that, there's a back and forth, and sometimes they prevail, sometimes they don't. But there is a track record there. But more broadly, I think it's important for the audience to know that actually across Trump too, the administration is not monolithic when it comes to the attitude towards engaging with the media. I mean, I think overall it's more kind of antagonistic, but I think the Pentagon is at one end of the spectrum when it comes to trying to limit access. The State Department, on the other hand, continues to operate relatively normally in terms of engaging with the media. They don't have a spokesperson right now who does briefings, but Rubio is, on his way to Munich right now with a plane full of journalists. And the White House, on the other end of the spectrum, Trump loves to insult the media, but he also engages with the media all the time and takes journalists plane full of journalists when he goes overseas to NATO or to wherever. So, it's a complicated situation because it's personality driven to some extent when it comes to each agency. And the Defense Department happens to be led by an individual who has a particular view of the media, the mainstream media in particular, and that I think is why we're seeing what we're seeing at the Pentagon and the Pentagon Press Corps.
I want to come to that individual in a moment and spend some time talking about the secretary, but Nancy, to the point that Missy made about the press being over time responsible when they find themselves in possession of information that an administration will say, or that without even an administration saying, but we as human beings recognize would potentially put people at risk. I have to point out that almost a year ago, Signalgate happened. This is our, this is an Atlantic joint, right? And our colleague, Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, was in possession of information at a very critical moment in this operation and declined to do anything irresponsible with it. And that to me is like one proof point of many that we could probably name in which we in the press did not behave irresponsibly. We demonstrated that we could be mature and patriotic and still do our jobs, right?
That's right. He didn't publish the details of the text in the first story in that spirit, and the Atlantic published them after the government said it wasn't classified information and sort of dared.
He had the receipts.
That's right.
Right? Yeah.
And I'll point out, since, at the press corps we call it the eviction, since the eviction in October, there was another example of that because several news agencies knew that the United States was getting ready to launch some kind of operation into Venezuela.
Venezuela, right.
And refrained from publicizing it ahead of time, even though they knew it. So there hasn't been, for all the retribution we've experienced, there has been an ongoing sense of responsibility to treat the information as what it is, which is fragile. We're applying the same rules that we've always applied to this. And that doesn't mean that if the government says it could be dangerous, so we automatically say no. But there is a thoughtful conversation that happens and has continued to happen even when we can't engage with the department in the same forthright manner relatively that we used to be able to do.
Yeah. Tom, Missy did this nice spectrum of the relations that the press has with aspects of the administration, Pentagon kind of at one end of the spectrum, State Department, kind of further down here, the White House further down here. I wonder where all of this is coming from. Is this entirely Hegseth-Hegsething? Is this Hegseth taking direction from above? Like, where is all of this coming from? Is this, everybody wants to associate everything with Stephen Miller. I guess I'll just put that out there. Is this Stephen Miller? Where is all of this coming from? Who is responsible for this?
I don't know, but it seems to me, and the Pentagon was I was a DOD employee for a lot of years.
Yeah, right.
It seems to me that that this does come from Hegseth because I think he's in over his head. And I think there's a kind of an insecurity there. And look, it's not hard to be in over your head running the biggest bureaucracy in the country without that kind of experience. And so everything is done in a very defensive mode with the assumption, and I think, the one thing we haven't talked about in the nexus between journalism and national security here, I think a lot of Hegseth's approach to this comes from the fact that he worked at Fox News for a long time, which views, which is a journalistic enterprise, but he came out of as, a partisan fighter, and the assumption is that anybody who asks questions, it means you harm, means to do harm to the institution, is trying to catch you out, is playing gotcha. The idea that people are saying, look, just tell us stuff so that we can inform you don't have to, nobody needs to know what time the raid is, but talk to the American people here. And you see this, that every time Hegseth goes before a camera, first of all, like so many people in this administration, speaking to an audience of one. Right. But the other problem is that he goes on, and it is that Fox mode of, I am not here to inform you. I am here to establish a point and drive it home and, not actually communicate anything, but rather to be a kind of a partisan slugger on this stuff. And that's understandable coming from the environment he did, but I think it's interesting of the places you're not hearing about, like state, like CIA, where there are always questions about national security that you want answered. I think the other place that's become a real problem is DNI.
Is Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah. And again, someone who is, in my personal view, way in over their head, has a very adversarial view of kind of everybody else.
Right.
including within the administration. I think Hegseth and Gabbard particularly, if you're asking where this is coming from, these are people who take a very adversarial view to kind of everybody because they worry about.
Yeah.
I would just add two really quick things. So Hegseth was at Fox for a long time, but one of the things he would say all the time is, "I'm not a journalist," and he felt proud of that. He had, even before he left Fox, when he was at Fox, he had a very kind of derisive view of mainstream media because he saw himself as a commentator, as a like explicitly partisan actor. And then I think the second point that's important when it comes to kind of assessing what he's done since becoming the SecDef is that the confirmation process was extremely contentious. It was the first time in history that you had to have a tie-breaking vote by the vice president to confirm a secretary of defense. And he blamed the media for digging up all of this information that was the subject of most of the hearings about his past. And he said this term so many times during his confirmation hearing, like anonymous smears, and so I think that was very impactful for him and kind of set the tone.
Left a mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just add one
Please,
other
yeah.
factor? It is not limited to just the press in terms of his intolerance of pushback. We've seen at least 24 generals and admirals leave, many of them for being suspected of leaks or just questioning decisions. And I'm not talking in a disrespectful way, in a way that was accepted before. And there is a climate in the building where you are not supposed to push back. You're not supposed to raise questions. We just saw it this week with Senator Kelly and the decision by the Pentagon to go after him for saying the outrageous statement that you shouldn't follow an order if it's against the law. And so there is a climate in which he has created, not just with the press, but across the department, in which pushing back on his approach or the president's approach, or even just asking questions, can be career-ending.
The Mark Kelly thing, I'm glad you brought that up. Let's take a small detour to that and come back, because again, we're trying to understand how this place operates, how the person at the top thinks about this stuff. So what happened? We know that this week there was a failure to secure an indictment. We didn't even know that there was an attempt to secure an indictment until we learned that it failed, to indict 6 Democratic lawmakers for a video advising active duty service members to refuse illegal orders. And then today, kind of the cherry on the sundae, was a federal judge blocked the secretary's intended punishment of Mark Kelly, right? This is emblematic of a retribution strain, not just in this department, but kind of across, Tom. This is consistent in the administration.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, I taught a lot of military officers over the years. I think everyone would be shocked at the idea that if you criticize the president, you are, as a civilian, retired, out of uniform, that you are called in and called back to duty and court-martialed. But again, it's very much Hegseth's. I actually think first of all, I think Missy's point about his time at Fox News, I think a lot of what he does is projection. He's assuming what other people would do if he were, But also, I think there is this tremendous insecurity, and you saw it when he hauled all these admirals and generals into this giant meeting. Our Elliot Cohen, contributor at the Atlantic, he had a great line about this. He said, this retired major was talking to a hallway that had the equivalent of 25,000 years of accumulated military experience in it, and was, kind of reading them the Riot Act. That's the kind of thing you do, not when you feel like you're in control of the situation, but when you feel beleaguered, when you think that, everybody's, people are making fun of you, they're not listening to you, and unfortunately, this department is every department in the U.S. government is important. The Department of Agriculture does important stuff, but the Department of Defense is the steward of the lives of our young men and women. Yeah. And the idea that you're going to approach everybody, including your own generals and admirals, as if they're kind of all out to get you is tremendously unhealthy, and it leads to the kind of problems we're talking about here with information.
So I'm going to read back to you a tweet from the other day that, of yours about the secretary. This is what you tweeted. Hegseth.
I categorically deny.
You bet but I have.
Excuse me, I've been hacked.
I have the actual words. Hegseth is exactly the kind of narrow, educated but not intelligent, narcissistic, spring butt kind of officer faculty always dreaded getting in a war college seminar.
But I want to say that I meant that in a respectful and life-affirming way.
Sure. Yes. I was like, you went all spring butt on us. I couldn't believe
spring
it.
butt.
Yeah.
For those of you that have not heard this expression, that's the guy in the seminar on day one who thinks he knows everything. He knows more than the professor. He knows more than Eisenhower. Right. He knows more than Patton. And every time you bring up a point, he says, well, you know, and finally you have to say, we get it. You're smart. Sit down. And he very much comes across that way as I must constantly prove myself. And again, I wrote a piece shortly after he was nominated. I said, look, and I tried to do this without rancor, but I said, the patriotic thing to do when if you were Pete Hegseth, the president comes to you and says, Mr. President, I am honored. I'm just overwhelmed, but I must decline this. I am simply not qualified to do this.
Yeah.
But instead he said, like that over-eager major that we all dread getting into summary.
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense, I got this.
I got it. Missy, is this true? You've covered 10 defense secretaries?
That's true.
Okay.
Not to date myself.
Defense secretaries. I did it, actually. Okay, so put Hegseth in the context of the ones who previously served in this office. Can you do that?
Oh, no, he's such an outlier. I mean, even for, I wrote a story recently about the way that he talks about violence and, normally the military leadership and the civilian leadership, the military is for fighting wars or defending the nation, however you want to think about it. But typically the use of violence is cloaked in, this kind of solemnity. People use euphemisms like someone's taken off the battlefield or eliminated. And Hegseth has really adopted a very different tone. He's tweeted doctored children's books with like a turtle, Franklin the Turtle shooting RPGs out of helicopters. He has talked about, killing narco-terrorists in a way that, I think I've talked to a lot of people in the military who are concerned about the message that sends to the people in the ranks, because it is a very awesome responsibility that the military has. The nation is indebted to them for risking their lives, but at the same time, the leadership is entrusted with this arsenal. Literally the world's second largest nuclear arsenal, he likes to pick partisan fights, and he's different in so many different ways. There's a focus on kind of personnel and fitness issues in a way that I haven't seen. He's talked about before he came to office, and to some extent suggestive in a way since he became Secretary of Defense, that the role of women may be different. That's something different that I heard in the time that I've been doing this in the last 20 years. So there's a lot of different ways that he is an outlier, and I actually think he wants to be disruptive. He thinks that the organization, the institution needs to be fixed. He wants to transform it. Most of what he's doing, as I said, has been in like the cultural and personnel space. I think it's TBD whether or not the culture of this kind of aircraft carrier that he's trying to turn will actually be changed. But I think there is a good chance that he's going to make some lasting changes.
Yeah. Can I just add? Yes. The problem, the tone that Missy's talking about, the word that I keep coming back to, it's juvenile. It's adolescent. And
boys with toys, right?
The kind of things he wants to fix. Look, some of those are things that need fixing, but that's why you have company commanders. Yeah. That's why you have captains and lieutenants. This is not something, the Secretary of Defense is supposed to be running this giant bureaucracy and aiding the president, and this is something we don't even talk about anymore because it doesn't happen, aiding the president in crafting strategy, working with the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, who are the same person now, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to sit down and say, what is the goal of of having all this military power? What is the point we're making? And instead, he's talking about, push-ups, which is what you do when you're a 28-year-old captain, not when you're the Secretary of Defense.
Nancy, we were in Charlottesville together in October, right after the October 15th pivot. And we were talking over dinner after that event about, well, what do you do now from a strategic standpoint if you're being told, can't be in the building, there are these now restrictions on this. And you said, effectively, look, I've got relationships with people in the Pentagon that go back many years who are not the secretary, and even though these restrictions have been put on, even in the midst of this, I still have sources. Like, that's true, right? You're still talking to people. You're still doing the reporting.
Yes, and a lot of them are doing so courageously. They're fearful when they're talking.
Right, the consequences for them would be enormous, wouldn't there be?
And because they believe in the public's right to know, they want the record set correctly in terms of what's happening. I find that I'm the one sort of being more cautious sometimes than they are in terms of putting their name out there or how we attribute something, because you're so mindful of exposing someone to punishment for engaging with us. You know the risk, and I feel a bigger responsibility than I did before October 15th to protect sources. I mean, it's very rare in my career someone said, I'll go on the record, and I go, no, don't do that. And now I find...
Like literally, you're saying to them, don't.
Just don't, because I want to protect that. And the other thing that's happened is you end up having more conversations with people who are asking themselves, like, am I still value added here? Can I still succeed here? Am I still wanted here? The changes that are happening at the Pentagon really are having an enduring impact that will, if it stopped today, I think would take another decade to actually change. And I'll tell you, and it's in the people. And when you spend as many years as I have in the building, you get to know and really feel a relationship with the people. That those 25,000 years of experience, some of those, if you're a 4-star general, they've invested you in some cases from the time you were a lieutenant colonel. What happens when 24 of those are leaving the building? Who's replacing them as people who generally have less experience moving up? I've had minority officers say to me, is there a place for me in this military? I've moved 5 times in this many years, and I'm not sure that there's a place for me. I've had sources leave and say, I don't think there's a future for me. And so what that sourcing has taught me is in these little daily interactions, you're seeing the change in the building, and that's what I've learned since October 15th. It's not just the access to the information, but it's putting every person is sort of giving me a little insight in terms of the shift that's happening with the macro shift that we've seen in the tone and approach to the department.
Tom, this is really the existential question at this point in the administration, when so much has been dismantled. So many guardrails have come down, so many norms have been obliterated, so many, things that we took for granted, the Department of Education, right, have been dismantled. How can we undismantle this? Presuming we get to a point where we go over the rise and there's an opportunity and a will, an appetite to undismantle this, it's going to take an enormous amount of time and effort, provided it's even possible, to undismantle this. Right?
Yeah, I'm trying to be a little more sanguine because, again, I did not serve in the military, but I taught, again, I saw hundreds and interacted with hundreds of military officers over the course of my career. And so I'll be a little more sanguine and say that the norms, the traditions, the ethos that have been part of the American military since the day George Washington took command in Cambridge in 1776, I think they're more enduring than Pete Hegseth. And I think that I think character and leadership will matter, and that I think right now you have a lot of people. And I think the kind of questions that Nancy's hearing saying, is this a permanent change? But I think that also, you can see it, and sometimes when command turns over
Yeah.
in places where, suddenly the institution or the particular command involved is reinvigorated. And, toxic leaders are forced out and better leaders come in. I really believe, having had the privilege of sitting with so many of these men and women over 25 years, that there is something in their political DNA, in their military DNA, that is a lot more enduring than this. I think I would be really worried if we were going to say, you know what, a couple of years of Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump can really unspool and unravel everything the United States military has ever stood for. I don't think that's true, and I don't think that's possible. But the kind of thing Nancy's talking about, with people just leaving and leaving a vacuum, then you have to ask, who are the people that are promoted into those positions? And one of the things that's happened in this Pentagon is we haven't paid attention to the people who are promoting the people that are taking that place. The guy that's in charge of personnel now, the Undersecretary of Personnel, is a guy that was so extreme, his name is Tata, that was so extreme and so unacceptable that the first time Trump tried to nominate him in his first administration, he was turned down. I mean,
in the first administration.
It was, right, it was just pulled back, and he was, this is a guy who is prone to conspiracy theories and really extreme behavior. Well, right now, he's the guy that's the top Pentagon official for picking the next generation of officers.
Right.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a worrisome.
Missy, I want to ask you the same thing I asked Tom. The way this question is often framed at a higher level within the universe of politics in this administration is, will Trumpism survive Trump? What I want to ask you is will Hegsethism survive Hegseth? Does it end when he leaves?
I think we can only point to, in support of Tom's point, we can only point to the previous secretaries of defense who tried and failed to make lasting change to the Defense Department and to the military, because, as I said, it's a massive organization that is difficult to change for good or for ill. I do worry, though, about some problematic precedents being set, and maybe an erosion of at least public standards for public discourse or partisan involvement, partisan speech in a way that might be hard to reverse. But I think it's too early to know on those things.
One aspect of this that I should have mentioned that will take time. Hegseth purged senior female leaders aggressively out of the military. Yeah. The next president, next secretary of defense are going to have to fix that damage and tell America's women in uniform, you are valued here. You are leaders. There is a place for you here. Right. Exactly.
All right, so minute and a half left. We'll just go down, starting with Nancy, then Tom, then Missy, quickly. What is the one hot spot in the world that, as a consequence of these restrictions on press freedom, we as a country, we as Americans, you think don't know enough about? The thing that we should be thinking about, even if we don't know enough about it right now, the one.
So it's hard to name one, but I think when all these military operations, there was a time where we had the opportunity to go on a ship, go with a unit, talk to the commander. We don't get to do that anymore. So right now we're seeing military assets being moved into the Middle East. We don't have real visibility on how the troops are preparing. And as it is, we don't have visibility into Iran. And so we're headed towards a potential military confrontation where we just have such little visibility on both sides in terms of what's happening. And I'm much more aware of it now, I think, because I think there's some expectation you wouldn't have that in Iran, but that we don't have it on our side as well, I think. You feel it a little bit more.
You have a great piece about Iran in the Atlantic today, in fact, on this very subject. Tom, what would be your one split?
For me, it's not a hot spot, it's an issue. Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons.
We still have them. And the way it's supposed to work is the last person who's in the room with the President of the United States when the order to use nuclear weapons is given is usually assumed to be the Secretary of Defense. The New START treaty lapsed a week ago. We have no treaty with Russia controlling the number of nuclear weapons or inspections or verifications, and no one's even talked about it.
Missy.
So it's not a place where we're currently active, but we're lucky in that the United States, unlike the 20 years after 9/11 is not currently involved in a large-scale combat operation overseas. My fear is if we do have another one, that we won't be able to do the kinds of things that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of embeds and oversight, and that will be where we really lose out.
Got it. Okay, we're out of time. Please give Missy, Tom, and Nancy a big hand. Thank them so much for being here. All right, thank you. Great work. Really good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great. All right.